Hello and welcome to Reimagining Entrepreneurship. I'm Professor Edgell. Today in Module 1-3, I want to talk to you about this big topic of immersion and opportunity sensing. And I've broken this into two parts. A part A, where we're going to focus in a bit on opportunity sensing, and then a part B, where we get a little more technical and talk about industries and markets. Okay, so let's begin with opportunity sensing. And in this particular portion, I want to talk to you about try to answer these questions for you. What are creativity and innovation? How might one become more creative and inventive by drawing upon design culture? And the last question I'm going to try to answer is, what are useful ideational techniques for opportunity sensing? So change, creativity, and innovation. So change, creativity, and innovation, how are they interwoven? Well, creativity leads us to innovation, which often then leads to outcomes for the organization. That's a good way to think about this at a very high level. And all of that together collectively is referred to as change. So we think about new ideas. We use creativity to come up with new ideas, and then we think about how to implement those ideas or to bring them out to the market. We often think of that, broadly speaking, as innovation. And then we hopefully get some organizational outcomes, and that can be, doing well for the community, doing well for the earth, perhaps, and making some money for ourselves too, right? So this is kind of at a broad level how they all interrelate or connect together. So any act of creativity in the organization that leads us down the path to innovate, that is to bring something out to the market, will require us to change the organization. So now let's move on and talk about a definition for creativity. And I propose one or use one that actually has 4 components to it. So let me walk you through each one of these 4 components. The first component really speaks to the ability of an individual or a group to produce work that is both novel and appropriate as judged by independent critics. So let me explain that a bit more. When we say novel, we really refer to original or unexpected, or something that just seems different as others would define different. So it's not about the creator or the creative person defining different, although they may certainly or should certainly have a sense of that. But the ultimate test or validation must come from others, right? Or independent critics, so other people. And appropriate refers to being useful, adaptive concerning your task constraints. So somehow it's not only novel and different, but it also could be useful somehow. That it could provide a kind of function or fulfill a function, or maybe reduce the constraints placed upon one, right? And again, all this must be judged by others. I've done some testing in this arena, and what I've seen is that if you ask a group of independent critics to judge how creative something is, there will be a natural distribution. So you'll see that some of the items being judged are viewed as being not that creative, and some are judged as being kind of mediumly creative, and some are judged as being highly creative. That same set of creative products, if you ask the creators to judge them, they all say they're creative. So there's no distribution, essentially. It's very skewed. And so that just kind of says that creativity ultimately must be judged by others, because ultimately we're talking about products or services that are used by others, right? So just a little word of caution there. It has to be judged by independent critics. Part 2 of my definition refers to it being that creativity is an ability, but it's not a fixed or inherent ability. Rather, it is one that relates to a particular domain and an expertise that's developed in a particular domain, and it can evolve and does evolve over time through deliberate practice. That one can indeed become more creative in a particular domain if they apply themselves and practice over and over and over, right? So it's practice makes perfect in a way, right? And there's a lot of research literature to support this position. Part 3 says that it is therefore not a mystical phenomenon. Sometimes historically we've thought of creativity as being something mystical or not well understood, but rather it is a systemic possibility for most people if they apply themselves and if they evolve through deliberate practice, as mentioned in part 2. Now, part 4 says that At the organizational level, organizational creativity actually has room for two different actor profiles, and that we need both, right? And one is what I refer to as the problem finder, and the other one is the problem solver. And we're going to, throughout this course, talk about various aspects of being a problem finder and being a problem solver. But at the organizational level, for the organization to be creative and ultimately innovate, we need to have both types of actors present in the organization, right? So those are my 4 parts to creativity. Now let's move on and talk about a definition for innovation. Historically, we talked about definition as basically a sequential 2-part process of ideation or exploration, as some have called it, and then commercialization or exploitation. And commercialization often referred to as just bringing the best idea into use, so kind of taking the best idea and implementing it, and then kind of throwing it out into the marketplace and seeing who would buy it. And this was kind of a historical, traditional definition. Many of us have moved beyond that definition, and we kind of now see it differently. We say that innovation is an information-driven, distributed agency process of changing social institutions and industry structures to permit the acceptance of novel market tradable value or utility. And this means that we just don't throw something out there, a product or a service, but rather we help the institutions and the stakeholders to better understand how they might use a new particular idea that we're putting out there into the marketplace. So it's about changing the mindset of the potential stakeholders or of the various stakeholders out in the marketplace and the institutional structures. We might have to change the laws or legal regimes, which are part of the institutions, to allow the acceptance to permit the acceptance of this new value that we're proposing. And throughout this course, we're going to be talking about how we change institutional structures, not just organizations, but also institutional structures. And some of the cases that you're going to debate and talk about actually address this. The Edison's light bulb case certainly addresses this issue of changing institutions. And so does Garrod and Carnot's work on the windmills, right? The comparative study of windmills in the U.S. and in Denmark, right? They also talk about changing institutional structures. So we will continue to talk about this throughout the course. And when we do talk about these various forms of innovation, they include products or services. It can be production processes, organizational structures, and or institutional structures. Changes to all of those can be seen as innovations. So now let's talk a little bit about this concept of design culture, talk more about it. We've already talked a bit about it in our other 2 modules. But at the heart of design thinking, as you probably remember, is this concept of focusing on serving other people, right? So in this case, we're thinking about people who could be customers for us. And we have to empathize with them and deeply understand their situation. And that calls for immersing ourselves kind of into their situation so that we can better understand their lifestyles, their constraints, what their wants are and what their needs are, because in doing so, we will generate, that can become the foundation for both being ethical by serving them and helping them and not harming them, and doing a good, coming up with a great idea for being an entrepreneur, right? So in my mind, we need to start with this focus on empathizing with what the people need. And that's what design thinking as a process starts with and says that we must do. So it's very useful. And also, this will require us or you, actually in this case it's going to be you, not me, right? You're doing this, for you to really get close to these people, to the people that you want to focus on and serve, right? And you see the word on the screen there is really big, serve. You need to understand their perspective so that you can better serve them, because your entrepreneurial venture, your business, it should serve them and put them first,
right? And so you need to embed yourself with them. That means you need to get out there in their world. You need to go out and immerse yourself into the phenomena that they're connected with. And that's why I asked you to kind of do this exercise that you've done this module. You're going to come into class and present what you found in terms of using those techniques. And that's because I'm hoping you'll get closer to understanding the real phenomena and the people embedded in it, and then better able to serve them through creating a venture. Opportunity sensing, therefore, is really you trying to better understand the humans that are involved in the phenomena, the social phenomena of concern to you, and one that you're passionate about and that you maybe have some insight into already. And this means you need to really understand it deeply, because you need to identify the right problem, identifying the wrong problem and solving the wrong problem, or having a solution already in your head that really doesn't solve any problem or help anybody really is an issue. So again, your job is to make sure you identify the real problems, the real opportunities. You need to frame the right challenge, and we can use design methods to better help with doing that. Right? And that's why one of our textbooks is the Kumar book, the 101 Design Methods book. And I want to talk to you a little bit about it. It's broken into what the author Kumar calls modes. And modes just really refers to phases. And so, there's a phase 1, right? And phase 1, in the techniques that are in there are useful for you to, if you use those techniques, they help you to better understand the world around the social phenomena. Mode 2 is about the context. So this is understanding the circumstances surrounding or involved with the phenomena. And those two together, modes 1 and 2, really are the foundation for the discovery phase, what I refer to as the discovery phase. And this is the foundation for understanding the situation of social phenomena, right? And so in our in-person session, this module, we will go through a quick discovery mode. We're going to go through a discovery mode, which will pull from the information you have already collected. You've gone into the field, you've used a technique from one of those two modes, maybe even from mode 3 as well. You've used a technique or two, and you've got some information, and we're going to try to put that information together, make more sense of it in our in-person session. Now, in mode 3, the author focuses in on people and gives you techniques to help you better understand the people. Those are the stakeholders involved with the phenomena. And in mode 4, there are techniques that help you to gain more insight into the people, the intent, the context, and so forth, right? So those techniques will help you make sense of collected research and information to better understand the phenomena, including the technology and the stakeholders. And those two, modes 3 and 4 together, constitute or help you to better understand the people, needs, and paradox. And we will also address those in our in-person session during this module. So I'm just trying to give you some background information and prepare you for this. Now, I refer to this whole process of ideation as I cubed, because I always say that innovation is a function of both immersion and ideation, right? So if we want to innovate, we need to think about first immersing ourselves into the situation, and that's really where modes 1 through 4 techniques come into play, or as I call it, the phases 1 and 2. In a moment, I'll talk more about those, and then we couple those with so we couple the immersion with ideation, and together, all of that together can yield really useful, productive innovation and entrepreneurship. So ideation, in my mind, takes place in five phases, actually: discovery and teaming. Phase 2 is people, needs, and paradox. 3 is brainstorming and prototyping. 4 is value and sustainability. 5 is communication and evaluation. And we're going to talk more about these phases as we go through them. But we're going to, and actually too, just a little reminder, entrepreneurs really enjoy these ideational processes, right? Just think about Betty Nesmith Graham and her liquid paper. She invented liquid paper, and think about the processes and steps she went through to evolve that and to eventually make it into a viable, thriving, sustainable business. And so today, and this, when we meet in person for this module during our in-person session, we're going to focus in on discovery and people, needs, and paradox, right? We're going to do those two. And in discovery, which is also a bit of teaming as well, because you're going to come together and form your teams. We share what we've learned, share the information we've gathered thus far, and we try to synthesize it to find some patterns there. And again, this is preliminary, but it's a beginning. And later, we'll keep going through more, iteratively going through more processes, and you'll learn more techniques, and you will go back and revisit some of the things that you think that you've formulated in this discovery phase. But we are going to get started with it. And you have to keep in mind that it's just a beginning point, and you're going to iteratively change that. And then also, we're going to go into the next step or the next phase, and we're going to think about people, needs, and paradox. And here we will try to understand the people and their needs and arrive at some sort of framing of the design problem or opportunity. It's really important because with that in mind, you can start to move forward and think about a solution, right? And of course, all of this is a kind of preliminary work because ultimately, as you get more information, and you will get more information, but as you get more information, you're going to need to be you're going to need to be flexible and adaptable. We'll come back and revisit some of these original conceptions. Now, what are some tips for ideation when we go through all of these ideational processes? It's quickly paced so that for the entire process, so we can go through the process. And this is essential. Quick pacing is essential because it allows for you to discard less relevant information. Because it's quick, you really do have to process a lot of information, but you got to do it quickly. And so you'll find out that what you do is you kind of discard the less important stuff. Because of the speed, you're forced to discard stuff and information that isn't important, right? And this avoids becoming mired in detail while allowing you to quickly review a lot of the codified and visual information. And it avoids the illusion of completeness. Sometimes we think everything's complete. And as I've been saying all along, this is a very iterative process. You're going to keep revisiting your assumptions and be adaptable. So in a certain sense, it's a bit messy and nothing is ever complete. We're going to make progress. We're going to develop and come up with some concepts, but you're going to, as you get more information, come back and revisit those concepts. So they're never really as complete as one might imagine or want. Also, teaming with diverse individuals usually reduces your risk of narrative fallacy and confirmation bias. And as you may remember, narrative fallacy is when we create these stories that try to explain the way the world is, but they're basically our stories that we're forcing upon the world. They may actually not be true. They may, in a positivistic way or in an objective way, they may not really be a truth. They're just convenient stories that we force upon data and facts, and that infer a kind of cause and effect. And the cause and effect may not be correct, though. So that's why it's a fallacy. It's a narrative fallacy. It's a story that is not true. So it's like fake news, effectively. But it feels good to us because in our heads, it kind of makes sense, even though in a scientific way, it doesn't make sense, right? And confirmation bias is when we go out and find information that selectively we discard information that doesn't support our narrative and we gather information that does support it, right? So we selectively choose information that supports our narrative, even though it's a fake narrative, right? And so those are all both very problematic. And the best way that humans have to avoid engaging in narrative fallacy and confirmation bias is to work with others who have diverse perspectives and to allow them to voice those diverse perspectives, right? So it helps us to reduce our decision-making errors. Very important, very important. Now, throughout the ideational processes, we need to both diverge and converge. So there are moments when we're going to try to create a lot of different ideas, as many as possible, and we're not going to want to be critical of those ideas. We're going to want to just generate. So we want to be generative. We want to have a diversity of ideas. We want to diverge and make a lot of ideas. And then there's going to be times when we need to focus, be critical, be selective, prioritize, and converge down to a few ideas. So we want to generate many, and then we will want to reduce them down to the best of, right? But we want to make sure we're discreet about this. First, we often need to generate many without being critical. All ideas are good. And once we feel like we've exhausted and made every idea possible, we're going to have to then say, okay, what are the best ideas here? And apply some kind of criteria and focus and consolidate. Right? So you'll use your collected information back and forth between individual, and you will at moments be doing something that's individual, and then you'll bring the team perspective in. So there's going to be a back and forth between individual and team perspective. And for those of you who have engaged in ICNY, you will understand and remember this, right? In addition, we use a structured process. You'll see that in a moment. I believe in highly structured processes, and I always tell my students, make sure you trust the process. We should not pre-decide outcomes before we go through the process. Rather, we should trust the process to yield outcomes. And whatever outcomes come from the process, those are probably pretty good. And we should trust the outcomes that the process, a structured process, gives us, right? And we use a structured process because often these are messy, complex problems, right? They're unstructured problems with unknown outcomes. And that requires that we use a comfortable structured process. And so I'm going to give you structured processes to help you with that. And again, lean on the tools. I'll be giving you tools. I'll give you a toolkit. There'll be, things that you've used for immersion and so forth. Any notes that you took when you're out in the field doing this preliminary work that you've just done or are doing now, right? And so you want to make sure you use all that information, use all those tools. And keep in mind too that we want to rely upon not just coded language, the spoken word, but the visual as well, gestural visual information, very important because it gives you more information. And we make better decisions typically on balance if we draw upon more information. So let's talk about the discovery process, and we're going to put this in action when we meet during the in-person session during this module. And typically for the discovery process, we go through multiple steps. So I'm going to just lay them out for you and give you some sense of what those steps are. So when we try to do this process, you'll be at least a little bit familiar with it. So step 1.1, typically we start by creating a name card that speaks to the deeper who you are and what you bring to the table. And then you will, with each person on your team, explain your card and the role that you feel comfortable in adopting on the team. That's step 1.2. Now, step 1.3, this is where it gets really important. Each member will tell their story of the immersion. So at this point, you've gone out into the field, you've explored a little bit, right? You have done this social phenomena piece of the first paper, and you're going to bring that information in. So you need to tell a story of what you experienced. And when you're telling your story of what you experienced, the other members are going to be taking notes. They're going to listen to interesting ideas that pop out at them, and they're going to do one idea per post-it note, and they're going to collect those as you speak. So you're going to speak, and they're going to record. And then when they're speaking and telling their story of immersion, you're going to record, right? And then in step 1.4, all members will place their ideas on a vertical surface, put them up quickly. And step 1.5, all members will debate and cluster these ideas by themes. You're going to find similarities in some of the ideas, right? You're going to find similarities, and when you do, you're going to put those together. You're going to see a kind of pattern, right? And then you will, in step 1.6, label each one of the clusters, and you're going to list those cluster labels or names on a flip chart. So we're going to go through that process. And again, we're going to talk more about it in person in class, but I wanted to give you a high-level understanding of it. And for those who've been involved in ICNY, you certainly are going to understand this because we use this process in ICNY. Now, and then there's, of course, step 1.7. As a reminder, we always take photos and record this information because later you're going to want to come back to that. As you iterate and get more information, you may want to compare new information that you have at that point to this old, what will then be old information. We always take photos. We want a record of everything that we do. We capture all that, right? Now, the next phase is people needs and paradox process. We want to go through that. And we're going to start out there, a step 2.1, with you, the individual on the team, alone answering two who, why, what cards. You'll get these cards, and the cards ask 3 simple questions. Who should we serve? And again, it's about serving somebody, right? You need to serve somebody. Why should we serve them? And then lastly, what is the problem or opportunity that they face? Based upon what you know to date, what do you believe the problem or opportunity is that they face? So you're going to do that individually, and we'd like you to do 2 of them because there may be 2 different people or 2 different who's, right, that you'd like to serve. Then in the step 2.2, all members will share and consolidate their information, because remember, if there's 3 team members, you should, at that point, when you start step 2.2, you should have 6 cards, and you want to consolidate those down into 2 because you're going to find commonalities. More than likely, you're going to find commonalities, right? You want to integrate. You want to integrate into 2. Narrow that down to 2. And then in step 2.3, you're going to now use the who, why, what cards, the 2 that you've created, and you're going to create 2 personas, right? 2 personas for your team, because you've narrowed this down to 2 who, why, what cards. Now you need to go into detail and create the 2 personas. These are real people. We're going to give you tools for this, right? And you need to give them a face, a name, a life, and you're going to follow the little guide. We have a little guide for you to follow. You're going to fill it out, but you're going to make these people real. Make them real. Step 2.4 is all members will list the wants and disagreements between the 2 personas. You made these 2 personas. Now, where do these 2 personas come into agreement, and where might they disagree? It's as if you were to bring these people together in a room, and if you did do that, what would they agree about and what would they disagree about? Really important to think about that, because that could be very stimulative very stimulative and generative. I help you to generate ideas for that will become the problem frame and the solution. Next, step 2.5, all members want to think about how you could resolve the tension by creating a design problem or challenge statement. This is not a solution yet. It is not a solution, but rather it is a statement, an integrated statement. And you can see the example that I have up on the screen here. You might say, and it goes in this formula. We state, because of why, how might we, what, for whom? And that equals a design problem. And I give you a concrete example. Because casual exchanges outside the classroom help to create new innovative ideas, how might we create a place for diverse students and professors from different disciplines to regularly interact? Now you see, it's a statement of a problem that brings both who's, or both people, both personas together, but it's not a solution yet, right? It's a step before the solution. Step before the solution. And that's what we're going to do when we come together in our in-person session. Now, I want to move into the B part, and I want to talk to you more about industries and markets. Focus on industries and markets, and I want to try to answer these questions. What are industries and markets? How might one analyze industries? How might one understand markets and customers? So, industries and markets. This really relates to us scanning the environment around the firm, around a potential firm, right? An entrepreneurial venture would be a potential firm, and understanding better the industry, the technology that is, as well as the customers, the people, the market that's out there. So an industry, so we want to understand how industry varies from markets. So industries are really a grouping of businesses. So an industry is a grouping of businesses that interact in a common environment as part of the value chain, right? In a moment, we'll talk about what a value chain is. I think most of you already know that, but in case you don't, I have a quick little review of that, right? Or distribution channel that delivers a particular good. So we talk about the automotive industry because automotive companies make vehicles, and those vehicles get assembled a certain way and they get distributed out to the market in a certain way, right? So the market, we'll talk about in a moment, but the industry is defined by the product or service it provides. We have the telecom industry. It provides phone service to us. So if we go to Sprint or if we go to Verizon, they're part of the telecom industry. If we buy a car, the car is manufactured by a company in the automotive industry. So a couple examples there. Now, a market is defined by the customer. And those are the people who pay for the value provided or the benefits of the product or services that are provided by the industry, right? And it's really key here that as an entrepreneur, that we understand who our primary market is. We identify the primary market. And that goes back to the humans and the people. We just talked a bit about that, right? Understanding the people that are involved in the phenomena, right, helps us to then identify how they can become customers for us, right? We need to understand what they want and what they need. And we need to make sure ultimately that when we conjure up a solution or something, that is indeed something that they really want or are willing to pay for, and that it delivers in an ethical way, benefits to them while minimizing harm. And that, of course, is what makes it ethical, right? So anyway, that's an understanding of the two. And another way to look at this is that really the humans are the market. When you think about the people involved, they are the market. The people are the market. The technology is the industry, the cars, right? The telecom, the handheld phones, the computer, right? The technology is the industry, whereas the humans, the people involved, they constitute the market. And of course, the two come together, right? The two do come together, and your particular firm, when you create your particular little venture, can actually bring the two together. You will bring a technology out to a group of people. You will marry the technology with the humans. You'll be the link between them because you will have a value proposition. And soon, not this module, but in a coming module, we will learn more about the business model. And value creation is one component in the business model. And that's kind of where we link the humans in the market to the technologies and our services. Now let's talk about industry life cycles. Industries are a bit like humans, and industries go through life cycles. They are like little babies. They begin. There's a few. The internet, the online, the internet was a little tiny industry back in the late 80s. I know, long time ago. Many new entrants, no dominant players emerging. It's not clear yet. It's starting to happen. Late 80s, this thing about the internet was starting to happen. It started to pick up a little steam. It started to grow in the 90s. Many competitors, healthy profits, because it's growing so much. Everybody can make money. Some acquisition of small companies. So AOL and Time Warner merged together, or Time Warner acquired maybe AOL. It's never clear who really acquired whom there. They say it was a real merger, but that was under the growth phase of the internet, right? And then you start to reach a point where the market is starting to slow down a little bit, right? And differentiation seems to become more important. Products start to get more differentiated, right? So you see a little more specialization. And then the market starts to get really saturated, and we call that the shake. And when a market gets saturated, it means that the growth is no longer as easy as it was, and we start to see a shakeout occurring, and you get these dominant firms emerging as weaker firms leave or fall out. And we've seen that happen, right? We've seen that happen in the internet arena. We've got a few big dominant players today, don't we? We've got Google, Amazon, you can name a few others, right? Yahoo is still kind of there, but barely there. In a very weak state. We've got Facebook. We've got a few more. We've got these few dominant players. I can tell you from having lived through this life cycle that it wasn't always that way. We had a whole lot of players. If you go back to the 90s in that growth phase, they were popping up left and right. I was a part of that popping up. I actually began as an entrepreneur, right? CarClub.com doesn't exist anymore. We were part of that 90s growth phase, heavy growth phase, lots of competition, a lot of growth, and a lot of profits. But again, that all changed in the 2000s. And here we are today. Dominant firms emerge as weaker firms leave. We're kind of getting into maturity now. The market is becoming saturated. Prices and profits begin to fall. And then at some point, a market or an industry goes through decline. There's falling demand, products become dropped. The internet, we really haven't seen that happen yet, the decline, but I do believe we're in a kind of maturity phase, right? Now, can industries get revitalized so they don't always go through decline? Could something trigger revitalization and a shifting of an industry? Yeah, that can certainly happen, and it does happen. It does happen. Maybe quantum computing will unleash a whole new, growth phase of the internet, right? I suspect it may. Is it there yet? No, it isn't. But certainly that could happen. That could happen. Next, I want to talk to you now about industry value chain, and it's an interesting thing to think about, right? Every business we know fits somewhere into an industry value chain. Now, are some firms vertically integrated? Yeah, that means that they pretty much some big corporations have businesses in every single segment of the value chain, every single link of the value chain. So yeah, could a corporation be vertically integrated? We would say vertically integrated. Yeah, they could be vertically integrated. But let's think about a typical industry value chain. There are the raw materials and the supplies that are needed for that. Then there are the manufacturers who take the raw materials and make that into something. They then sell that to either agents or wholesale distributors, and those wholesale distributors then in turn sell that out to retailers, who then in turn sell it to the end user or the consumer. It's a very typical value chain, and this would be for a business to consumer, right? Typically, this is how it works for business to consumer kind of arrangement. There are other types of arrangements. We often also talk about business to business. I might be a business selling a supply to another business. I might make certain things that are needed by Ford to manufacture its automobiles, right? So I might buy raw material, manufacture hoses. Those hoses, in turn, I sell to Ford. Ford uses those hoses when they make their cars, and then they sell their cars to dealers, and dealers sell them out to the end consumers, right? So this is a typical value chain arrangement, and you can see some dollar figures up here on the screen. Maybe the raw material, the company that sells raw materials sells it for $4. The manufacturer then the base manufacturer does something to it, converts it into a product that they sell at $6 out to the wholesaler or the agent. And then the agents and wholesalers sell them for $10 a unit to the retailers. The retailers then sell them for double that, about $20 to the consumer, the end user, right? And these are not unusual. These ratios that you see on the screen, just so you know, they're pretty common ratios, actually. So you might want to just make a note of this. Hey, the professor gave me a little insight here. Let me go back when the time is right. Let me go back and look what those ratios were. Now, what's really interesting, too, is that one issue is that you, as an entrepreneur, will at some point need to figure out, where does my venture fit into the industry value chain? You're probably going to fit into an existing industry. Now, if it's a highly emergent, brand new industry, the value chain may be less clear. By definition, it's just emerging, right? But a lot of you are probably going to choose to go into an existing industry where the value chain is probably better defined, and you will at some point need to decide where you want to focus, or where your firm will play in the value chain. Another way to look at the value chain is to think about when you do your social phenomena. Sometimes we think of social phenomena just being about consumers, but you could be interested, for example, you may say the phenomena that I'm interested in is how manufacturers in a particular industry sell to wholesalers, right? I just put the little circle there on the screen to kind of highlight that. And you may go out and study that. You may say, in the automotive industry, I'm kind of curious to learn more about how the manufacturer sells out to the dealerships. They don't really the manufacturers, Ford doesn't go to a wholesale distributor. They rather go direct to the retailer. And the retailer in this case would be the car dealerships, right? So you may say, I want to study that better. And in fact, Elon Musk did study that phenomena. And he said, hey, why don't we even have a retailer? Why don't we even have a distributor, right? He looked at the value chain, or he and his team looked at the value chain and said, you know what? We want to manufacture the car and then sell it directly to the end consumer. And by doing so, we can capture more of the value in the value chain. Interesting. So sometimes entrepreneurs revisit and kind of remake the value chain, and that's their innovative contribution, if you will, right? So keep that in the back of your head, that innovation can occur through reevaluating and revisiting the value chain. And you may say, that's the phenomena that I want to study. That's a social phenomena. Absolutely, right? It involves humans and technology. Absolutely, absolutely. Now let's talk about firm environments.
And the external environments of the firm, well, let's look at all the environments of the firm. Let's start off. And the firm has many environments, actually. The first environment that is furthest away from the firm, if you will, is the natural environment. And we look at the natural physical environment because we're concerned about sustainability. We look at physical resources, the climate, wildlife, and so forth. We're going to talk more about this particular environment in Module 7 because that module has been dedicated to sustainability and organizational change together. So those have been integrated together. So we're going to talk about that environment later, a few modules from now. Today, though, we are going to focus in on the societal environment of the firm. Sometimes that's also referred to as the constructed environment. And we look to the societal environment of the firm because we're concerned about the future. So this is, again, further away from the firm. So it's not the immediate environment of the firm, not the immediate operating environment, but certainly it's important to look at the societal environment or the constructed environment, because there we need to think about long-term economic forces, long-term political legal issues, technological developments, and socio-cultural forces. In a moment, we're going to talk in more detail about this. The next environment that's really probably the most important one that we might traditionally have thought about with firms, and that is the industry or task environment of the firm. And here we look to this environment because we're concerned about profitability. And this is our daily operating environment. The next environment is actually the competitors that wrap around us, our direct rivals, and we look at them because they are the ones who on a daily basis exert pressures upon the firm and cause us to take quick decisions and make responses, right? Like force us into being a bit reactive at times. So we have to look carefully at the competitive environment, and we will do that later today as well. And then, of course, the last environment is actually the internal environment of the firm. And as I mentioned, we're going to talk about that in our next module. So today we're going to focus in on societal, task, and competitors, those particular three environments of the firm. It's important to think about not just the defined trends, but also the weak signals that are out there in those environments. And we're going to talk more about defined trends versus weak signals, but I want you just to be aware that we're looking at various different kinds of information that might be interesting for us to understand in these particular environments. Let's give some thought now to the societal environment. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are economic variables we have to think about. There are technological variables. There are political legal variables and sociocultural variables. So there's a lot for us to think about if we look at this societal level environment. And again, we're looking there because we're trying to understand what's going to happen in the future and how might I, in terms of planning for my firm, respond to that, either in terms of the threats that it may pose and or the opportunities that may exist in this long-term future environment. So if you think about economic, well, some of the things that, of course, I'd want to understand would be the GDP trends for the particular markets in which I sell and manufacture, correct? The interest rate trends, the money supply trends, inflation rates, and unemployment levels, wage and price controls, devaluation, revaluation, energy availability and cost, disposable discretionary income. These are all typical trends, as I would say, defined trends that are fairly predictable, not perfectly. We know examples when these kind of predictions don't come true. But these are trend data that are fairly easy for you to get and have a fair amount of reliability. Fair amount of reliability typically. Technological. What do we look at here? Well, under defined trends, we would look at total government spending for an R&D. Certainly that would be important. Or state funding for R&D. Total industry spending for R&D. A focus on technological efforts, patent protection. Why would I care about patent protection trends? What if patents are getting weaker and I'm investing more in R&D, right? That might actually mean that I'd have less protections for my property. New product development. What are the trends for new product development? New developments in technology transfer from lab to marketplace. Think about us here at SUNY IT building Quad C, the Nanotech Research Center, hoping to do more technology transfer from lab to marketplace ourselves here. So forth. You can look at the rest of these on your own. Political, legal, antitrust regulations, environmental protection laws, tax laws, special incentives. So what are the trends for each one of those? And usually this data is relatively straightforward to find and relatively somewhat reliable. Sociocultural, what kind of lifestyle changes are going on in the marketplace with the different groups that you serve or would like to serve? How are career expectations changing? How is consumer activism changing? What is the rate of family formation and the types of families that are being formed? Growth rate of the population, age distribution of the population. We just talked about that, did we not? Regional shifts in population, life expectancies, birth rates. These are some of the most typical kinds of data that you'd want to start to collect if you were analyzing the societal environment. And again, you would analyze not just this data, but you would think about other kinds of trend data that you know for your industry that might be interesting. And I would recommend that each of you, for the particular business that you're investigating, that you find the industry report for that business. And usually in those industries, will do a great job of highlighting key trends that are interesting for you to know if you're in that industry. It's the great way to find some of that information. Of course, the big question that always comes up is, well, which defined trends are most relevant to my industry or company? So I think the initial step is to collect as much data as possible, and then later it's to kind of sort it out and prioritize it and say which particular data is interesting. And we're going to go through a framework in a little bit that enables us to do that. Also, you need to think about the past 5 or 10 years, the estimated trend for the coming 5 to 10 years as well. So I try to look at the past 5 and 5 going forward, so I'd have a 10-year spread, 5 estimated and 5 actual, to give me a sense of where I think these trends are going to lead to and what might be possible for the firm. Also, we need to look at not just basic trend data. Basic trend data, the defined trend data, is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition for strategic success. So in addition, we need to consider what some have referred to as weak signals. And those are the hints in the marketplace of changes that are perhaps coming down the road. But right now, the trend is not clear. So therefore, we call this a weak signal. It's you searching for hints in various different places. Now, there is a wonderful article up on Edgell that I just posted for you in this particular module folder that speaks to this issue of weak signals and gives you tips and approaches to use to reveal weak signals. I'd like you to go up there and read that. I think it's going to be a great help for you as you think about your particular business and looking forward to the societal environment and where trends might be emerging over time. So here we're talking about the weak signals that could give indications of potential trends that will emerge later. Very important to do. And I've listed this under supplemental module reading in the M5 folder. Now, another great way to help you if you're looking for weak signals is to think about the particular category, and we're talking now technology. Technology is one of the 4 buckets or big categories of societal variables that we want to look at. This is why I want you to think about the trends that are most important, because if you know the broad trends, then you may have an idea where to look for the hints. So, for example, the GRIN framework, I think, is very useful for you because that GRIN framework covers genetics, robotics, information technology, and nanotechnology. And those are considered to be the 4 key trends of research, or 4 streams of technological development for the future. So this could act as a kind of guide to you. So you ought to be screening for genetic developments. What's going on in the genetic realm? What about the robotic realm? What's going on in that realm? Information technology or artificial intelligence, what's going on there? And nanotechnology, what's going on there? And how might the faint signals that are there portend something for my organization in the near future? So just a hint. And of course, you could do this similar thing for each one of the 3 other buckets, if you will. But I put this up here for you because we are a school of technology, and I want you to especially be aware of the broad trends that are going on in technology. Now, in addition to looking at these 4 broad areas, genetics, robotics, information, and nanotechnology, you'd also be looking for how are these categories, if you will, merging together And what kind of interplay is going on between the four categories, the G, R, I, and N categories? What kind of interplay is going on between them? Because in that, maybe some hints or weak signals that could help you to see new futures coming up on the horizon. And then lastly, for those of you who want a little background in GRIN, there's a wonderful book that was written a few years ago called Radical Evolution. And the book was based upon these four key streams of technological research that most scientists agree are the most important areas of technological development for the future. Joel Garreau looked at how these various technologies might play out over the next 50 years. Now, the book was written in 2005, so it's a bit old now, so I wouldn't necessarily look to it for the future trends, but I would look to it for some basic understanding of each one of these four categories, if you will. I think it's a great source for that, and it's a relatively inexpensive book to buy. It's not required, but I do recommend it. I think it'd be quite useful. So let's move on and let's think about some particular trends in the sociocultural area of the societal environment. The book actually did a pretty good job of defining some of the key trends that seem to be emerging in that particular area, and that all companies to some degree, or all businesses, might find interesting. Number one, they said it's pretty clear that there's an increasing environmental awareness out there in the marketplace. And we think about Ford and how Ford has positioned itself, Toyota as well. They seem to be tapping into that environmental awareness and playing upon it and finding benefit and opportunity in doing so. Number two is growing health consciousness. Now, this doesn't mean that everybody's doing something about it. Certainly, we know that the incidence rates for obesity are strong in our country and other markets. But at the same time, there does seem to be a growing health consciousness, and think about Whole Foods and how they've tapped into that trend. Three would be the expanding seniors market, and I just gave you evidence for that, some factoid that proved that there is very likely to be an expanding and growing seniors market, and that could mean opportunities. The impact of the Generation Y boomlet seems to be around and about, and these are the children of the baby boomers, of course, and so they're kind of a mini boom, boomlet, I guess, mini boom. And so there may be implications to this. What kind of values do they have? They seem to have different values than their parents did. And what does that mean in terms of marketing the products or creating new kinds of products and services? 5 is declining mass market, and I think this is very interesting. This is also referred to as the long tail. And what this means is that because of technology today, essentially it's enabled through technology. Because of technology, we no longer need to make all products the same in a category. So we can introduce a lot of customization because of technology. And because consumers are aware that there is technology that enables that, they now expect it. So the idea of having one particular type of product be used by everybody is gone. And so today we have to look more to these smaller groups that each need a variant of the product, a customized variant of the product. And you're going to be dealing with that actually in CapSim. You may not realize that yet, but you're going to be dealing with that in CapSim. All the possible variants feeding into different market sectors. Declining mass market seems to be a strong trend, and again, driven by technology. A changing pace and location of life, and I can certainly attest to this. I live most of the time here in Utica, but some of the time in San Francisco, my home there, and I travel quite a bit back and forth. I go to Europe quite a bit to lecture there and to visit friends there. I used to live there. So I can attest to that. And why is that interesting to know? Well, if that's going to increase, it may mean greater demand for new kinds of services, for example, or perhaps new kinds of products. Think about having cloud drives. I'm convinced that the cloud drive concept, to some degree, was driven by this idea of having your data secured in a cloud, kind of automatically backed up. But I think it's also driven by this notion that we need to access our data from multiple different locations and places. And I think it's hard for us to do that if we don't have a cloud kind of storage device to do that, help us with it. 7 is changing household composition. This means that the traditional nuclear family, as we had envisioned it historically, the mommy and the daddy and the 2 kids, isn't quite the typical household today, or may still be a majority household, but certainly there are other kinds of household compositions emerging. Single parent families, for example. And why is that interesting? Well, single parent may need other kinds of products or services that 2 parents may not need. So there may be different demands and different opportunities as a result of that. And then 8 would be the increasing diversity of the workforce and market, and that, of course, could mean opportunity for different kinds of products and services. So these are some big trends that seem to be emerging, and they seem to be pretty strong as well, and they may or may not be relevant to your firm, but I think they're interesting to know about. Now, Professor, how do we go about getting this kind of data, this kind of information? As I mentioned earlier, I think industry reports are a wonderful place to begin. I would start with looking for any and all industry reports about your particular industry. In those reports are typically good data about projections for various changes that are relevant to that industry. Competitive intelligence, those are great. Look at any data you can find about the competing firms. In there, you may find trend data as well. News sources, why not go online and listen to news reports and so forth, right? Scientific research databases, such as the ones that may be available to you here at SUNY IT through our library, journals as well. Social networking and joining professional organizations. One of the best ways to think about weak signals or to get more information about weak signals is to go out and talk to people that are on the ground in the industry. And that means joining an industry group and going to the meetings and networking, doing some social networking, getting to know those people, and through knowing them, get access to their information, have them tell you what they are seeing, and aggregate that information. Again, social networking. I think it's a wonderful opportunity for you, even though you're a student. I know many of you do work in organizations, and you probably have access to professional organizations. Almost every industry has a trade association, for example. So you could join, if you're not a member, join that trade association. If it's not the industry in which you work, you could still possibly join it as a student. Often the trade associations are very happy to have students joining. They like to take you under their wing and kind of help. And so that might be a great opportunity. And of course, in general, the internet represents incredible opportunities to find data and information as well. Of course, with the internet, you need to be careful about reliability of data. So credibility of the source becomes very important. Also, you can see the detailed guideline for assessments, plus Wheeling and Hunger on page 120 talks about sources, database sources that you might be able to tap into, and the SUNY IT library guides give you databases too that you could tap into. And the book Green the Gold, I think it's fantastic because in there they collected so much trend data about environmental issues. So if your company is one in an industry where environmental issues are especially interesting, then you might want to grab that book and look at the trend data that they had collected and have available to you. So now let's move on and talk about industry. This is the more immediate operating environment surrounding the firm. We talk about the industry forces model. We used to actually call this Porter's 5 forces, and you may have heard of it or used it before, but we kind of think of it now in a little bit different way because we've added this other force called other stakeholders. Other stakeholders introduce other forces into the equation as well. So we no longer have just 5 forces. And so we look at the various key stakeholders that surround a firm. And of course, the most immediate environment around the firm is its rivals. So we look in the middle. The first force is the intensity of rivalry among existing firms. And then we think about potential entrants and the threat of new entrants. We think about buyers and the bargaining power of buyers. We think about substitute products. What are substitute products? Well, substitute products are different products that could be used, right? It's a different category of product that could be used in lieu of your product. So, for example, if you were selling cars, the substitute would not be another car. It could be a bicycle. It could be public transportation. It might be walking. Right? So those would be substitutes. So we need to analyze the threat of substitute products or services. We look at suppliers and think about the bargaining power of suppliers. And then lastly, we look at all the other stakeholder groups and think about their power. And what are some of those other stakeholder groups? It might be the government, it might be unions, it might be special interest groups, it might be local community groups, and so forth. So those other different groups exert a kind of pressure on the firm, and we need to try to understand the relative power of those particular other groups. And of course, we look at the industry environment or the operating environment of the firm because we're concerned about profitability. We want to know, is this an attractive or unattractive industry? Because if it's unattractive, it's probably unattractive because we're not likely to make a lot of money, because the forces are so strongly set against us, against the firm, that it's going to be difficult to make money in that arena. And of course, if that were the case, if you had an extremely unattractive industry, you might want to think about moving the firm from that industry into another industry, or selling off the assets, taking the proceeds and investing in another firm in a more attractive industry. And so the first force we look at is rivalry among existing firms. And then these are the other forces. F2, threat of new entrants. F3, threat of substitute products. F4 is the bargaining power of buyers. F5, bargaining power of suppliers. And F6, the relative power of the other stakeholder groups. And what I want to do now is focus in on the first one, the rivalry among existing firms. Now, Professor, this is the first for us. How could I go about determining if it's high, medium, or low? Is it highly intense or is it kind of weak? Right? I need to think about how to determine that. And the book, if you actually read this chapter, gives you strong guidelines on how to do this, how to go about doing it. And I'm going to do this for you now. Here, I'm going to walk you through some of the key variables you'd want to look at if you're trying to determine the intensity of rivalry. So the first one I would look at is the number of competitors. We know, statistically, probabilistically speaking, that the more competitors there are, probably the more intense the rivalry. Probably. Is that always true? No, it's not necessarily true. But as a rule of thumb, think about this. What's easier to track and monitor, one other competitor or 1,000 other competitors? I think you'd know the answer there. It's one other competitor. So the fewer the competitors, the greater likelihood you are to coordinate with them and to understand them and to track them. The more there are, the more randomness and more dynamic becomes the marketplace, and often the more competitive it does, if all other factors are equal. Number two, what is the market speed? And what do I mean by market speed? What do we mean by market speed? Well, market speed refers to fast, medium, or slow. What is a fast-moving market? What's a fast-moving market? What if I asked you about the handheld telecommunication industry or the handheld devices as a sector of the telecom industry? Is that fast-moving, slow-moving, or medium-moving? Well, I think it's fast-moving, right? So fast-moving usually means new products are developed and introduced within a 2-year span. So within 2 years or less, new products are introduced. Slow-moving typically means anywhere from 5 to 10 years. So slow-moving industry is 5 to 10, and anywhere from 2 to 5 is a medium-moving, a medium-paced market. The faster the market, typically, the more intense the rivalry. Faster the market, the more intense the rivalry. The rate of industry growth. The slower the growth, probably the less intense the rivalry. If the industry is growing at quite a bit of a rate, that means the pie is expanding. So for you to keep a decent market share, you don't really have to compete that hard, do you? If the industry is rapidly growing, every firm can kind of pursue its own interest to some degree, and are going to get a slightly bigger market share the next year just because the entire industry is growing. Now, it becomes more problematic when the industry isn't growing. If you want to increase your market share, it becomes a zero-sum game, and you're going to have to do it at the expense of somebody else, or they'll be doing it at your expense. So the rivalry typically, if all other factors are equal, becomes more intense if the market isn't growing much, if the industry isn't growing, or if the sector isn't growing. And the next one we look at is the amount of fixed cost. Typically, the higher the fixed cost, the much more difficult it is to move around and about, and sometimes the more intense the rivalry as a result of that. The height of exit barriers. So the higher the exit barrier, typically, all other variables being the same, typically it's more intense rivalry. Think about it this way. If we were sitting in a classroom together and we were all getting very hungry, and I locked the doors, and then I put a piece of bread on the table, and your hunger kind of kept going up, and there were, let's say, 20 of you students there. Would that be pretty intense rivalry if you couldn't exit and go find food elsewhere? Yeah, at some point you might be willing to fight each other to try to get that piece of bread. Even if it was stale bread, you might be willing to fight each other. Whereas if you could exit the room and go someplace else and get food, you might tend to do that instead of fighting each other for the free piece of bread sitting there on the table. Correct? So if the exit barriers are very high, you might be forced to fight it out, slug it out for market share. And what do we mean by exit barriers? Well, we mean the ease by which you could exit the industry, that is, sell off the assets and move your assets or move the firm itself into a different industry. The more difficult it is to do that, typically all the variables the same, typically the more intense the rivalry. And so your idea is to take these variables and analyze this aspect of your industry and then determine, is it a highly intense rivalry or is it a low rivalry, right? So that's the first thing you'd need to do. Now you'd want to go on next and talk about potential entrants. What are the threat of new entrants? So here I want to clarify. The higher the barriers to entrance, the lower the threat of a new entrant. So the bigger the wall around the industry, the less likely a new entrant is to enter that industry because there's a wall there. So the higher the barrier to entry, the lower the threat. The lower the barrier, the higher the threat. So we're trying to analyze threat. And one of the first things we look at is economies of scale. The higher the economies of scale required for competing and operating in that industry and having a good margin on the product, the greater the demand for economies of scale, then the higher the barrier to entry is. Therefore, the likelihood or the threat of new entrants is lower. Next, we look at product differentiation. Typically, the greater the possibilities for differentiation, the greater the threat that a new entrant may come in, because the greater the possibility for someone to focus in on a niche opportunity, and kind of get a wedge into the marketplace, a foothold in the marketplace. The lower the product differentiation, typically, and these are general rules of thumb, the lower the product differentiation, typically the less attractive, so the greater the barrier, so the lower the threat. Capital requirements, and capital requirements often dovetail with economies of scale. So the greater the capital requirements, the more a barrier exists to entrance. Therefore, the threat would be lower. If I loop back to economies of scale for a moment and think about that, you think about the automotive industry. To produce a car today, effectively sell it in the marketplace, to do that in a cost-effective way so you have decent margins, the margins that are demanded by investors, you typically have to have a very vast economy of scale. And that's why you don't see too many new car companies in America, for example, in the last decade, with the notable exception of Tesla. And Tesla, for exactly this reason, is struggling. Tesla struggles because of the need for economies of scale. Tesla's cars are very expensive because they don't produce that many relative to Big Three or to other car companies. They don't produce that many, and that drives up their unit costs, which then makes their prices very high if they want to get a decent margin, right? Switching cost. What are switching costs? What are switching costs? Well, it's a cost for the particular type of audience you're pursuing. It's a cost for them to switch to a new product. If you think about Walmart versus Kmart, new retailer on the scene, how much switching cost do you have if you're a consumer? How much switching cost do you incur if you try a new retailer? Probably not a whole lot. I'm guessing not a whole lot. Probably the greatest switching cost you'd have in that case would be you turning the wheel of the car one direction versus the other direction. So Kmart's on one side of the street and Walmart's on the other side. So not a whole lot of switching cost, probably. Whereas if you are a firm that's adopted a particular computer platform, let's say you're standardized around Windows and you want to switch to Mac, there's probably some cost in switching to Macintosh, right? To Mac computers or Apple computers. There's probably some cost for you because you've got to do a lot of things, right? You have to get new software, perhaps. You have to train your users. You might have to train your IT department as well on Apple products. And all that may represent a big switching cost. So the bigger the switching cost, the general rule of thumb, the greater the switching cost, the greater the barrier to entrance, the lower the threat of new entrants. Access to distribution channels. If the distribution channels are already locked up by the key players, then it's probably less attractive for a new entrant to enter because they'll have trouble getting distribution. Access will cost them dearly, and as such, they'll probably not want to come in. So if access to distribution channels has already been taken by key players in the industry, that presents a higher barrier to new entrants, and the threat would therefore be lower. And then lastly, government policy. It could be a barrier to new entrants. I know often we'll hear in the pharmaceutical industry lots of complaints about government regulation and requirements, but on the other hand, it is what protects that industry. That industry, it's very difficult because the huge investments required for all of the testing. And I'm glad they do the testing, by the way. I want to make sure that if I get a new drug for something, it's not going to harm me. So I'm glad they do. But that does cause the barrier to be higher. So the threat, therefore, in the pharmaceutical industry is lower to new entrants. There's a lower threat of new entrants because of that. Again, you need to look at all these variables when analyzing the threat of new entrants. And ultimately, you need to be able to step back and say, hey, I think the threat is high or I think it's low, right? Now, you'll need to do this kind of analysis for all the other forces too, F3, F4, F5, F6, and then you need to pull it all together, look to the book. It gives you great detail on how to do this analysis for each one of these other forces. And then you can actually look at the chapter, that particular section of the book. I PDF'd and put it up on Angel, so it's there as well for you to use. Again, for each one of the forces, you need to determine, is that force high or low? And then you'll need to step back and determine, is this an attractive or unattractive industry? Our goal in this process of analyzing the industry is to determine if it's attractive or unattractive. Because if it's unattractive, then it's probably not going to yield much profit, right? And if it is attractive, there's probably great potential to make profit and to be in that industry. And we're looking at this from the perspective of a business that's in the industry now, a business that's in the industry. So what would an unattractive industry look like? What would an unattractive industry look like? I want you to imagine those forces, how they might play out if this industry were to be deemed unattractive. What would it look like to you? Well, you'd probably have low entry barriers. Anybody can walk in. Therefore, the threat of more competition is great. Suppliers and buyers have strong positions, so you as a focal firm in that industry probably have weaker bargaining power with suppliers and buyers. There are a strong threat of substitute products, and there's intense rivalry among the existing competitors. If I saw all of those forces in this kind of configuration, I would say that it's an unattractive industry. That would look like an unattractive industry to me. Why? Why is that unattractive? Because I know my potential for profit is very low. And it's going to be more difficult for you to even try to collect funding, right? Think about raising funding or getting investors for the firm. If you're in an unattractive industry, it's not only bad for you because it's going to be because of low profit potential, but also your potential for getting investment capital, for managing the firm and investing in new R&D and so forth is probably going to be low too. So that equals low investment potential as well. Now, an attractive industry looks very different. An attractive industry has high entry barriers. You're in that industry now, your firm's in the industry now, and there are high entry barriers. That's a good thing. These suppliers and buyers have weak positions. There are a few threats from substitute products. And of course, there's moderate rivalry among existing competitors. And wow, that looks attractive because I know if I see those forces playing out in that manner, there's high profit potential. And when there's high profit potential, I know that investors are very interested. I'll have a great opportunity to gain investment capital so I can further grow this firm and do things with the firm, right, in this particular industry. Very interesting in that case. And let's start off with talking about the strategic group's approach to understanding your competitors. We need to understand our competitors, and what we do is typically create a market space, and on that market space we plot the competitors and see how they fall into various different clusters. We typically, in plotting the market space, look at two variables, and we look at the two variables that are most important for being a successful competitor in that sector. So in this case, we're looking at the fast food market, and we know that average price offered for the menu, as well as limited versus full menu, or that is the product line breadth, those are the two most important variables for this particular market space. Now, if you're using this for your market space, for a particular firm that you're interested in, then you need to look at that sector and what competitors compete on in that space, or what rivals use to distinguish themselves in that particular space. But we know in fast food it is price and it is product line breadth. And what we do is we plot the competitors, as I mentioned earlier, and when we do that, we see clusters emerge where they kind of bunch up together, and we can identify these clusters using a strategic typing methodology. And there we look to defenders, what we call defenders, prospectors, analyzers, and reactors. And so I want you to take a moment here and look at this space, and I want you to identify who you believe are the defenders. The defenders are the ones who are seeking extreme cost efficiencies. So they're most concerned with cost efficiencies. Who are they in this space up here? Well, yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward. The Arby's, Domino's, Hardee's, Burger King, Wendy's, Dairy Queen, Taco Bell, and McDonald's cluster are the defenders because they do compete on price. Think about Taco Bell when it announces some new product in the marketplace. They often talk about how cheap it is, how inexpensive it is. And in fact, to the point that I'm a little bit afraid to eat there sometimes, right? It seems like, how can they possibly offer food for that lower price? But that is because they are a defender. And so what's interesting about that is that if I know what their likely moves are going to be, I know that they're likely going to compete upon lowering their cost or finding ways to lower their cost. Next are the prospectors, and the prospectors are most concerned with innovation. And now innovation is relative to the market space. So you can't think about innovation in another sector. You need to think about what looks like innovation in this particular market space. And of course, what passes for innovation here may not be innovation in another market space, but of course it would be considered innovation in this market space. So who do you think the prospectors are? Who do you think the prospectors are? Well, that would be the Red Lobster, Olive Garden, and Chi-Chi's group, right? They of course don't have extremely low prices, but they have reasonable prices. And they often introduce new variations to the menu. So they focus more on new combinations, right? The new steak and lobster combination. You might see Red Lobster doing that, for example. So they tend to focus less on price and more on the kind of combinations. So again, now I know what they're likely to do on a daily basis as competitors or as rivals to my firm. They're likely to focus more on variations of the menu, slight new mixtures and combinations that may to that market segment look like somewhat novel introductions, although in other spaces they wouldn't be deemed to be that innovative or that novel. But in this market space, it is considered to be novel. Who are the analyzers? Seeking efficiency, some combination of efficiencies and innovation. Well, Shoney's and Denny's and Country Kitchen and those types are the analyzers because they're trying to find a balance between price, keeping the prices pretty reasonable, and doing some variations to the menu, right? So they try to combine the two together, and we find that that's a difficult thing to do. But again, once you understand that and see the cluster, you'll know that's what they're trying to do. And then lastly, who are the reactors? Think about the market space up here as you see it. Who are the reactors who don't have a clear strategy? Where would they be located? Who are the reactors up here in this marketplace? Well, the reactors are the Ponderosas and Bonanzas of the world. They are charging a fairly high price, but they have a limited menu. They don't do a lot of new innovation. And so think about that. How attractive is that to you in the market space? Slightly on the higher side for the sector and not introducing much novelty. How likely are you to go to that firm? Is that a legitimate strategy? Slightly higher price, but not much in the way of bells and whistles. Is that a strategy? No. Actually, it's a non-strategy zone. It's a non-strategy zone, and there are two non-strategy zones up here on the map because these are places that don't make sense in the market space. And so if you occupy it, it's probably because you've been slowly pushed into it by reacting to the daily moves of the competitors. And the way to counter that is to have a deliberate strategy that works within these strategy zones up on the map. So you need to keep your firm out of the no strategy zones by being deliberate, by pursuing either some form of differentiation or some form of low cost, right? Now, Ponderosa, why is that a no strategy zone? Well, because I don't know many consumers in the marketplace that want to pay a slightly higher price and not get a slightly better product, actually get perhaps a lower quality product for a high price. Conversely, I'm sure there are lots of people that would love to get a full menu, a little more on the high side of bells and whistles for the lowest cost possible. But what kind of firm can endure that kind of pressure on its margin? Probably not. That probably isn't wise. So you won't have any margin and you probably won't stay in business for very long. So that's also a no strategy zone. That lower right corner is a no strategy zone because think about it logically. Offering a better menu, a slightly better menu with more novelty at the lowest price probably isn't possible. You probably won't have much in the way of a margin. And if you don't have margin, you won't stay in business. So that's probably no strategy zone as well. So a great way to kind of analyze your rival set and the immediate competitive space of the firm.
So now let's switch over and start to talk about markets a little bit more. We mentioned that, and you understand what a market is. It's the humans that will buy something, right? But they're the humans, the people. But we need, as entrepreneurs, to be specific in the beginning about really understanding who the particular individuals are. Who are they? We have to make them real. They have to be real. We have to know them well enough that they're real. And we've already talked about this, right? I think we've talked about it in the first 2 modules. I've talked about it already within this same video, but I keep coming back to it because a lot of would-be entrepreneurs don't always do this. And they learn sometimes the hard way later, and then they actually do get to know the customers and get to know the individuals and get to know them as real people. But I can't emphasize it enough, so I am repeating it a bit. So the markets, and keep in mind too, what we're doing in these first few modules and the couple more modules to come is really what I've identified as the pre-phase. It's enhancing the human. Eventually, you will use the textbook and all that good advice about how to analyze the markets or the humans and figure out how much disposable income they have and where they live and so forth. You'll gather a lot of technical information about them, but that comes a little bit later. The first part is to just understand them as individuals and humans, their wants, desires, and needs, what their challenges and problems are, right? And that's what this whole, in a way, this whole enhancing the human preface is about, because it just helps you to try to get a big rough idea about them and get out and know them. And then later you can refine that with refined information and use the techniques that the textbook shows you. You know, the main textbook shows you techniques for doing market analysis and so forth. But initially, I really think you need to get out there and start to know them, and we should be experimenting initially by forming hypotheses about the problems and needs in about the customers, or needs of the customers, right? And these hypotheses, and that's what we're going to do in our session. You know, you're going to arrive at some kind of problem or design challenge statement, and that is your hypotheses about what you believe they need. Over time, as you get more information about that customer, get closer to them and better understand them, you're going to refine that hypothesis because you will have tested it with more information. And I'm going to ask you to go out and meet with some people that you want to serve with your business venture idea and get their input on it, right? We need you to meet with the real people, make it real. And everything we're doing is about really, really digging into who are these people that we're serving, right? And, you know, you will make this hypothesis in the classroom, right? We're going to work on that together as a team. And then you're going to go out and make first contact. You're going to keep getting more information. And you're going to have to iteratively, as I've said, iteratively reformulate some of the hypotheses and test them again. So that's why it's a little bit like an art. It's a little bit messy. You know, because we never are really certain, are we? And we never have complete information. We get more information, but it's never really complete. So we can keep getting closer to better understanding them and better serving them, but it's never perfect. And by the way, too, over time, those people you serve, they're shifting and changing, and you will need to, if you are successful and get your business up and running, your venture running, you will need to shift and change it over time because they are shifting and changing. And so is the competitive landscape, and so is the industry around you, right? Just as a little FYI. And so it is an iterative process. It may go through several cycles before you will be satisfied that the problem being solved is the right problem and that it's matched to the right customer. So that's why that's why I've called this the pre-phase, because it's just beginning. It's certainly not the end by any stretch of the imagination. Let's be clear about that. And we often begin by using what are referred to as ethnographical treatments for observing customers. You know, ethnography is a way to explore the social, cultural aspects of people, and we try to study them in their everyday environments. So let's go out and meet with them and observe them where they work and play in their natural habitats, so to speak, right? And, you know, using some of those techniques in the Kumar book, and by now you've gone out or you are in the process of studying the social phenomena, you should be seeing people in their everyday environments, in those social environments, you know, those social phenomena environments. We need to collect the data from a variety of sources, the most important and insightful of which are from observing and informal discussions with those people. Observe them and talk with them. There's nothing more insightful or valuable than that. Get to know them, right? Analyzing them through using descriptions and explanations. And this mode 3 in the Kumar book is really all about that, right? It's about, the process to some degree we're going to use in this in-person session. But it's really about you ultimately getting out there and talking to them and collecting information that way. Very informal, very straightforward, but very necessary. And some would-be entrepreneurs don't do this. And this is the most important aspect, I think, to really having a winning idea that does a lot of good, delivers a lot of benefit and minimizes harm, and therefore is ethical. Right? Now, the textbook also gives you a lot of tips for doing this, and then later gives you a lot of tips for really analyzing the market, as I said earlier. So we'll get into that later. When you get into the business plan, the hardcore business planning phase, you will really need to go out and get, reams of that data, how much disposable income and so forth. But right now, it's about talking with them to see where their pain is, where their challenges are, where they need help in the simplest way possible. Well, my friends, I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. Make sure you go back to the syllabus and DGA, review them carefully so that you understand what is required for the next module, both the readings, the watchings, the video watchings, as well as all the deliverables. I thank you.